Okay, so in this video what we're doing now is we're going on to the second reason why the demand curve slopes downwards. And again, I would ask you to try and remain calm. You may need to rewatch this video a few times, but realizing what we are doing is trying to explain the law of demand. We're trying to explain why the demand curve slopes downwards. We're trying to explain why a price rise leads to a reduction in quantity demanded and why a price fall leads to an increase in quantity demanded. Okay, now back to this. So why does the demand curve slope downwards? So in the previous video we looked at this idea of the income effect. Now in this video we're going to look at the idea of the substitution effect. Please, please, please guys, remember two things. We are trying to explain only changes in prices and how they affect quantity demanded. So why does an increase in price cause quantity demanded to fall, and why does a decrease in price cause quantity demanded to rise? And when we are talking about a substitution effect, we are not at all, they may be, but they do not have to be substitute goods, all right? Not at all, okay? So please, please, please keep that in mind. Now, so when we're looking at this, we might as well just start with a definition. The substitution effect. When the price of a product falls relative to other products, there is an incentive to purchase more of this, since the marginal utility per price ratio has improved. Okay, now this will make sense more in the next video, but all I'm saying is, all the way back to the equimarginal principle from the videos on playlist 1.2, basically people always buy more of a relatively cheaper good because they want the best value for money. Okay, and what that means is they're getting more marginal utility per euro spent on this good when the price falls than they were before the price falls. Okay, so consumers will switch away from other goods. If the price of good A falls, consumers will switch away from buying good B and consume more of good A, because good A is relatively cheaper and good B is relatively more expensive. And the consumer always tends to buy more of a relatively cheaper good, and it's the substitution effect that causes the consumer to always buy more of a relatively cheaper good. So let's just have a chat now, right? We're all going to have a nice chat and we're going to have a look at this example. All we're saying is if the price of a good falls, you're going to buy more of this good. Or if the price of another good rises, you're going to buy more of this good and less of the other good whose price has risen. So let's have a look here. We've got two goods. What are they? Pepsi and pizza. Now, I think you would agree that they are not substitute goods. Okay, that's the first thing that I want you to understand. They're not substitute goods. Okay, now all we're going to say here is the price of Pepsi rises. That's all I'm going to say. Now, what has become relatively cheaper and what has become relatively more expensive? And what does the substitution effect say will happen to the demand for both goods? The price of Pepsi has risen. Therefore, Pepsi has become relatively more expensive. And pizza, even though its price has not changed, pizza has become relatively cheaper. Cheaper to what it was relative to the previous price of Pepsi. Or the new price of Pepsi, excuse me. It's cheaper now, relatively. So what does the substitution effect say will happen to the demand for both goods? Well, you always buy more of a relatively cheaper good. We've said that the pizza, even though its price hasn't changed, has become relatively cheaper. So and Pepsi, because its price has increased, Pepsi has become relatively more expensive. So even though they are not substitutes, guys, the idea is you will buy more pizza and less Pepsi. And again, bringing it back to the equimarginal principle, because the marginal utility per euro spent on pizza has now increased relative to the marginal utility per euro spent on Pepsi. If you don't understand that, that's fine. Just go back to the whole big 6 series of videos on Unit 1.2 about the equimarginal principle, right? Now let's have a look here and let's chat. In a second, I'll ask you to pause the video. For each of these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I hope you can see some are substitutes, some are not. They do not have to be substitutes, okay? For each of the following state, which good has become relatively cheaper? Which good has become relatively more expensive? I'm Irish, I say dearer, I hope that makes sense. And finally, what does the substitution effect say will happen to the demand for each good? So I want you to look at each situation and then apply and answer each of these 3 questions to situation 1, and then each of the 3 questions, situation 2, 3, 4, and 5. And ask you to pause the video there, and when you reckon you have an answer to all of them, please press play and we'll come back to it. Okay, well hopefully you've had a chance to do that. So let's look at this one. Coke and Pepsi, the price of Coke falls. Which has become relatively cheaper? Again, we're assuming a ceteris paribus relationship, so everything else has remained unchanged. So the price of Coke has fallen, so Coke has become relatively cheaper. Which has become relatively dearer? Well, if Coke has become relatively cheaper, by definition, Pepsi must have become relatively dearer, and it has. Okay, even though the price of Pepsi hasn't changed. And what does the substitution effect say will happen to the demand for each good? Well, it says because Coke is relatively cheaper and the substitution effect says you always buy more of a relatively cheaper good, the demand for Coke will fall. Now don't forget, your income has stayed the same. So how are you affording this increase in the amount of Coca-Cola that you're buying? Well, you're reducing the amount of Pepsi that you're buying because it's relatively more expensive. Right? Now, magazines and coffee, they are not substitutes, I don't think. The price of coffee falls. Okay, so which has become relatively cheaper? Well, coffee's price has fallen, magazines' price has stayed the same, therefore coffee is relatively more expensive, and the magazine is coffee is relatively cheaper, and the magazine is relatively more expensive. So what does the substitution effect say that will happen to the demand for each good? The substitution effect says you always buy more of a relatively cheaper good. So as the price of coffee has fallen, making it relatively cheaper, you will buy more coffees. Your income, your nominal income has stayed the same, so therefore you'll have to reduce the amount of magazines that you buy. And that's literally it, okay? You always buy more of a relatively cheaper good, you always buy less of a relatively more expensive good. Bicycles and jeans, I don't think they're substitutes. The price of jeans fall. Jeans have become relatively less expensive. Bicycles have become relatively more expensive. The substitution effect says you always buy more of a relatively cheaper good, so therefore you will buy more jeans and less bicycles. Okay, TVs and books. The price of TVs rise. Which has become relatively cheaper? The price of books has remained the same. However, relative to the new price of televisions, they have become relatively cheaper. TVs have become relatively more expensive. The substitution effect says you always buy more of a relatively cheaper good. You will switch away, you will reduce the amount of TVs that you buy and increase the amount of books that you buy because books are relatively cheaper and TVs are relatively more expensive. Now, the last example here is holidays and insurance. Again, I don't think that they're substitutes. If anything, they're probably complements, right? So again, the substitution effect does not only apply to substitute goods. So, what does the substitution effect say will happen to the demand for each good? Right, the price of insurance falls. Insurance have become relatively cheaper. Holidays have become relatively more expensive. The substitution effect says you always buy more of a relatively cheaper good and less of a relatively more expensive good. So your demand for insurance will rise and your demand for holidays will fall. That's all. I mean, these are for illustrative purposes, but that's all that we're saying. Okay, so now let's take this and again, remember, we are talking about the price of one good changing, but that will affect the demand for a number of goods. So the price has not changed. We are starting out here at price P1, out to the demand curve, touch it, go down, we get Q1. That is the quantity demanded at the price P1. Now, if the price falls, okay, stop. There has been a price change. We are always trying to explain why the demand curve slopes downwards, why there's a law of demand, why following a price reduction people will buy more. We have already explained in the previous video through the income effect. Now we're going to try and explain it through the substitution effect. What we're going to say is this good has become relatively cheaper. I will buy more of this good instead of other goods because you always buy more of a relatively cheaper good. It's better value, so I buy more. What I'm trying to say to you is because this good has become relatively cheaper, people have a tendency to buy more of it because of the substitution effect. Don't forget the income effect happens as well, but because of the substitution effect. So that explains a fall in price, ceteris paribus, the price of everything else remained the same. So this good has become relatively cheaper compared to all goods in the market. So therefore, we're going to tend to buy more of this good and less of others. And that's what the substitution effect says, because it's relatively cheaper, following the price fall, and you always buy more of a relatively cheaper good. Now, again, we're starting off, and what we are trying to explain is the law of demand. So there has to be a price change in order for the law of demand to apply. And in this video, we're explaining the law of demand through the substitution effect only. So basically what we're saying here is following an increase in price, go out to the demand curve, touch it, go down. That's the quantity 2. That's the amount that was bought at price P2. There has been an increase in price. So why are we buying less of the good now according to the substitution effect? Right, well, we're buying less of the good now because the good has become relatively more expensive. So therefore, the consumer will buy more of other goods instead of this good, because ceteris paribus, the price of every good in the economy hasn't changed, but the price of this good has risen. Therefore, this good has become relatively more expensive to every other good. So I'll buy more of this good because it's worse value, it's relatively more expensive, so I buy less. I get more marginal utility per euro spent on other goods than I do this good. Okay, so I reduce the amount that I buy. Guys, I understand that may be technical. I really hope you get it. I think, it's explained in a relatively straightforward way. Do not worry about it. You understand this intuitively. It's just that economists need to feel intelligent. All we're trying to do is explain how price changes affect quantity demanded. And thank you so much for watching. I really do hope this helps, and I very much look forward to seeing you in the next video.